The looming threat of the Galactic Empire cast a vast shadow over Earth, an ominous herald of conquest that obscured the sun. Imperial legions landed on the planet with cold precision, dismantling resistance with relentless efficiency. Earth, battered by decades of internal conflict, was ill-equipped to stand against the invaders' overwhelming power. Cities crumbled, armies disbanded, and even the most defiant human strongholds fell beneath the Empire's unyielding force. In a secluded village nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, life persisted in grim defiance of the new order. The Empire, deeming the region insignificant, had ignored it until whispers began circulating of a man, ancient and resolute, who refused to bow down. This was no ordinary rebel, the tales said, but a keeper of secrets too old for even the stars to recall. Vlad III, a name etched in history, was not easily swayed by threats. His eyes, deep pools of knowledge and sorrow, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires long before humanity even dreamt of leaving their world. To the villagers, he was a recluse, a guardian of forgotten lore, a protector of the land. To the Empire, he was a curiosity, then an annoyance, and eventually a target. The soldiers marched without warning, their movements as precise and emotionless as machines, through the village's cobblestone streets. The leader of this force, Centurion Kuran, was a towering figure clad in gleaming silver armor, his face concealed by a reflective visor. His voice boomed with authority as he demanded the villagers gather in the square. By the decree of the Galactic Empire, surrender all relics, artifacts, and persons of interest. Resistance will be met with immediate execution. Vlad emerged from the shadows of his humble dwelling, his movements slow yet dignified. His presence silenced the crowd. The villagers parted like waves before him. Though his form was slender and his attire simple, an undeniable power emanated from him. "You speak of relics," Vlad said, his voice low yet resonant, "but you tread upon a land whose history your empire cannot even begin to grasp. Leave now, and you may yet retain a shred of honor." Kuran chuckled harshly, his voice amplified by his helmet. "Bold words for a man whose world is in ruins. You will submit, old man, or you will die." The Centurion's soldiers raised their weapons, sleek and deadly constructs of alien design, glowing ominously in the twilight. The villagers gasped, fear evident in their eyes, but Vlad remained unshaken. His gaze locked onto Kuran's visor, and for a moment, the Centurion hesitated, an unfamiliar chill creeping down his spine. "You have made a grave mistake," Vlad said, his tone heavy with quiet finality. The first shot was fired, a searing bolt of energy aimed at Vlad's chest. But the old man did not fall. Instead, he stood tall, his form shrouded in shadows that seemed to defy the light. The bolt harmlessly dissipated, absorbed by some unseen force. Panic swept through the villagers as chaos broke out. Kuran barked orders, his soldiers unleashing a barrage of firepower, but Vlad did not retaliate. He stood motionless, his expression unreadable, as if appraising the worth of his attackers. The shadows around him deepened, becoming colder, more oppressive, until even the bravest soldiers faltered. Then, as quickly as it had started, Vlad raised a hand. The soldiers were flung backward as though struck by an invisible tidal wave. Their weapons clattered to the ground. Kuran staggered but stayed on his feet, his visor cracked and sparking. "Foolish child," Vlad intoned. "You do not understand what you have awakened." But before he could act further, the sound of reinforcements echoed through the valley. The Empire had prepared for resistance, and this time, they brought overwhelming force. Troop carriers descended from the sky, flanked by drones armed with energy cannons. Kuran, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage, shouted, "You think yourself invincible, old man? We'll see how long you stand when the full might of the Empire bears down upon you." The villagers, who had been watching from the safety of their homes, began to weep and pray. Some fled into the forest, while others held their children close, waiting for the inevitable. Vlad turned his back on Kuran and walked slowly toward the village center. "Do what you must," he said softly, "but know this land will not forgive your trespass." The reinforcements arrived, their weapons trained on Vlad. Despite the overwhelming odds, the old man remained calm, resigned to the inevitable. The soldiers surrounded him, and Kuran gave the order to fire. The barrage of energy blasts was deafening, shaking the very earth. When the smoke cleared, there was no sign of Vlad, only a scorched patch of earth where he had stood. Kuran exhaled slowly, his nerves on edge. "It's done," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. The villagers watched in silence, their faces a mix of grief and fear. They had lost more than a protector, they had lost a legend. Yet deep in the Carpathian forest, something stirred. The air grew thick with ancient power, and shadows seemed to come alive. Miles away, in the crypt of a forgotten castle, a figure awoke. Eyes that had been closed for centuries snapped open, glowing with an unholy light. Dracula, the last true son of Vlad III, had risen, and vengeance burned in his heart. The Empire had desecrated his father's memory, and for that, they would pay. Dracula's gaze swept over the crypt, his senses attuning to the world above. He could feel the presence of his father's killers, their arrogance and ignorance tainting the land. "They will learn," he murmured, his voice a deadly whisper. "They will learn what it means to provoke the bloodline of the dragon." With a single, fluid motion, he ascended from the crypt. The castle's walls resonated with his power, and the night embraced him as an old friend. The Empire had made its move, but now it was Dracula's turn. The stillness of the Romanian night was shattered by guttural cries and desperate screams. A squadron of Galactic Empire soldiers patrolling the outskirts of the village vanished without a trace. Their communication abruptly ceased, and the only clue to their fate was a message written in their own blood upon the frostbitten soil: "This land is not yours." Dracula moved like a phantom through the shadows of the forest, his senses heightened, his purpose clear. The centuries spent dormant had dulled neither his strength nor his resolve. He had inherited his father's unyielding pride, surpassing it with a cunning sharpened by time. Now, the blood of those who dared defile his legacy would stain the ground. The first strike came swiftly. A fortified Imperial outpost perched on a nearby ridge was wiped out in mere minutes. The guards, confident that no earthly force could challenge them, barely noticed the dark mist rolling through the camp before it was too late. Dracula descended upon them with the ferocity of a storm, his claws tearing through armor as though it were parchment. Energy weapons fired blindly into the night, but they found no target. When reinforcements arrived, they found the outpost empty, its walls drenched in crimson. Each body had been drained of blood, their expressions frozen in terror. At the center of the carnage stood a single banner, an imperial insignia slashed and smeared with the mark of the dragon. The news of these attacks reached Centurion Kuran as he prepared to deploy additional forces into the Carpathians. Sitting in the command center of a towering dreadnought, he clenched his fists in frustration. The reports were fragmented, filled with confusion and fear. The survivors, if they could even be called that, spoke of an unstoppable force, a creature cloaked in darkness, its movements too swift for the eye to follow. "This isn't a war," Kuran growled, slamming his fist onto the steel table. "It's slaughter." Beside him stood General Malik, a battle-hardened strategist who had overseen countless campaigns across the galaxy. His voice was steady, calm, as he spoke. "We underestimated the primitives of this world. That was our first mistake. But this is something different." Kuran sneered. "You're not suggesting the superstitions of these villagers have any merit, are you?" Malik narrowed his eyes, gesturing to a holographic map of the region. "I am suggesting we tread carefully. Whatever we are facing, It knows the terrain better than we do. It strikes with purpose, not desperation. Kuran dismissed the general's caution with a wave of his hand. Then we draw it out. Deploy an elite strike force and bait it into the open. We'll see how it fares against the might of the Empire. Unbeknownst to the Imperials, Dracula was already one step ahead. He had intercepted their transmissions, deciphered their codes, and tracked their movements with uncanny precision. His centuries of predation had made him a master tactician, and the Empire's reliance on technology was a weakness he intended to exploit. As the strike force descended upon a seemingly abandoned monastery, they found Dracula waiting. He stood atop the crumbling structure, his crimson cape billowing in the wind, his pale face illuminated by the cold moonlight. He made no attempt to hide his presence, a deliberate challenge. The soldiers advanced cautiously, their weapons trained on the figure before them. Though they had been briefed extensively, they knew this was no ordinary insurgent. Still, their confidence in their superior firepower remained unshaken. Target acquired, their leader announced over the comms. Engaging now. Dracula smiled, a cruel, predatory expression that sent a shiver through even the most seasoned warriors. With a single fluid motion, he leapt from the rooftop. His descent was faster than the eye could track. The first soldier barely had time to scream before Dracula's claws found his throat. The strike force responded with precision, unleashing a barrage of energy blasts, but Dracula was no ordinary foe. He moved with supernatural speed, weaving through the hail of fire with an elegance that defied logic. His strikes were calculated, his every movement orchestrating death. Within moments, the once confident strike force was in disarray. Some fell to Dracula's claws, their bodies drained of life. Others succumbed to their own panic, retreating in fear, their footsteps echoing through the empty monastery. Dracula stood amidst the carnage, untouched. His eyes burned with an unholy light. He allowed one soldier to escape, his screams carrying a single chilling message back to the Empire: "You have awakened a nightmare." As the Empire scrambled to comprehend the scale of their failure, Dracula's campaign of vengeance intensified. He targeted supply lines, sabotaged communications, and dismantled outposts with surgical precision. His strikes were unpredictable, his movements untraceable, yet every act of destruction served a purpose: to draw out Kuran and his forces, to make them pay for their hubris. In the days that followed, the villagers began to speak of Dracula with reverence. To them, he was no longer a distant legend but a savior. Though he did not seek their adoration, he accepted their offerings of food and shelter, ensuring their safety in return. He was no tyrant, no mindless beast. He was a protector, a warrior bound by an ancient code. Meanwhile, Kuran's frustration boiled over into desperation. His forces were stretched thin, his men demoralized. The Empire's promise of invincibility had been shattered, and the shadow of doubt crept into the hearts of even the most loyal soldiers. "He's toying with us," Kuran spat, pacing the command center. "Every move we make, he's already countered. It's as if he knows our plans before we do." Malik, ever the pragmatist, offered a grim solution. "Then we stop fighting on his terms. If he refuses to meet us in open combat, we force him to defend what he values most." Kuran's eyes narrowed. "The village," he said. "Destroy it. Burn it to the ground. Leave nothing for him to protect. Without his sanctuary, he'll have no choice but to face us head-on." The plan was set in motion as Imperial forces mobilized for their assault on the village. Dracula, however, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He could feel the weight of the villagers' fear, their hopes pinned on his ability to protect them. It was a burden he bore willingly. For his father had taught him the value of loyalty, even to those who did not share his blood. The Empire's fatal mistake had not been underestimating Vlad III. It had been failing to recognize the bond between a father and his son, a bond that transcended death itself. Dracula was no longer merely a creature of vengeance. He was a force of reckoning, a harbinger of the Empire's downfall. As the first flames began to rise in the distance, Dracula stood at the edge of the forest, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The Empire had declared war on his bloodline, and he would answer with fury unmatched by any mortal or machine. The night belonged to him, and he would ensure that it remained so.